Okay, the SIFT approach is something that was developed by Mike Caulfield a while back. And it's a way of evaluating information. And I already shared, oops, we have someone else in. Is that you, Maggie?
No.
Okay, let me put the link in the chat again. There we go. And if you grab a copy of these slides, there's a few links that you may want to use to explore later if you do decide to use one of these approaches. We live in a world in which there's a lot of information that is not always verifiable. And we've had a bit of an explosion during the last 7 or 8 years of information being put up by various political groups or by people in other countries on behalf of one political campaign, but not the other typically. But in any case, we've seen a lot of falsified news stories and so forth. And there's also a lot of information out there on sites that people use to sell various products. And students are not always very well trained in critical thinking or very well trained in being able to recognize what are legitimate sources and what is not. And the SIFT approach is developed by Mike Caulfield as one of several approaches that can be used to systematically address what type of information is reliable and what may not be. And it's a very simple move. It's a very simple approach that consists of what he refers to as 4 moves: stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and then trace the claim, quotes, and media to their original source. And let's just talk a little bit about each of these, and then we'll take in some examples. One of the things that happens is certainly during political campaigns, with the increasing polarization we see in our society, it's really easy for people to use emotionally charged information to post things out there on social media that tends to be automatically reshared. I was almost going to say retweeted, but this Twitter has sort of fallen into some type of cesspool, but we have a lot of other information that gets reshared, often to other people with similar viewpoints, without often people even reading it. At least Facebook now does say, if you try to reshare an article that you haven't read because you trust the author or because you've read it in some other area, it will warn you. Are you sure you want to reshare this without reading this? So, that's at least one step in the right direction. I don't know if that's ever stopped anyone from resharing it, but it's at least one good thing that's being done. But basically, before you reshare it, try to analyze it more carefully and also check to see if the publication is reputable. Look at the URL, see where it's coming from, see who the alleged author is. If you search on the internet, you'll find lots of current quotes from Abraham Lincoln. Apparently, Frederick Douglass came back to life about 6 or 7 years ago, too, at one point, at least according to one president or whatever he was. In any case, so before sharing anything, stop, think it over carefully, and think, is this something that's reliable enough to reshare? And then if you think maybe it's worth it, investigating the source. And the types of questions you can ask are pretty logical ones. Who is the author of this? Are they a credible source? Who's the publisher of the material? Is it coming from some particular organization? In particular, is it coming from a particular political party or some type of a campaign organization? Or is it perhaps someone trying to sell you something? What is their agenda? Why are they sharing this information? And then if all those things seem reasonable, if the information seems somewhat credible, and if it seems like maybe there's some legitimate information there, you might want to go out and find better sources, unless the source you initially found is coming from, a highly reputable organization, a government agency, perhaps some type of reputable research organization in a field that and even then, make sure it's really the group that you think it is, because lots of groups have come up with names very similar to legitimate groups. And for example, there was a company that sprang up for a while with a web address of abcnews.com.co, for example. And if you didn't look at the whole web address, you might very well think it was actually ABC News. But find other more reliable sources. And just make sure that the information is not just coming from one single source. And then, because so much news is shared, even with the reduction in the number of reporters out there, a lot of groups just simply report things that they pick up on the various news feeds. When possible, trace the claims, quotes, media to their original context. So you trace it to the original source. And then let's just look at a few cases in practice. And I wanted to avoid any political quotes out there because so many of them actually turn out to be true. When you see something that looks completely ridiculous, like no candidate might possibly ever have done this or said this, it does turn out to be true. And we see enough of that in our everyday news sources. So I just picked a couple of these. Here's one, which is kind of absurd when you look at it, but it's actually remarkably well done. And then you notice that the source turns out to be The Onion. And you can pretty much decide that, well, this is probably not a real news article, but it's probably worth reading anyway, just to see what they had done. And The Onion is coming back to life again after being moribund for a while. But we probably wouldn't want to spread this as a real news article. And I have cases where I shared satirical sites online, the Borowitz reports and so forth, and had people not recognizing that it was satire and then posting all sorts of angry responses to it. So even if you do find satire that is really well done, you might not want to share it just because some people are going to get really confused by it. And now I'm not sure why this is not letting me go ahead. Okay, here. This is one that may be a little tougher. If you're new to education and you see this, this quote on a page, and we'll go to the page in a second, it says, learning styles are crucial in education and understanding them can come with great benefits. So let's go back to the source of this. And we can see the source of this page, it's right here, here's that quote, is teach.com with edX. And actually it's something that's sponsored by a group that's part of edX. And it looks sort of legitimate, and you can read through it and it all seems really credible. And you see they're also advertising some of the courses. It's an edX product where they're looking at teaching certificates coming out of Harvard, Northwestern teaching certificates and so forth. And you've got this whole VARK model of learning styles and how you should teach them. So, that it looks at least legitimate, and teach.com sounds pretty legitimate, and you can check to see about edX, which has done this, and you see it's a parent company of edX. It looks like a pretty legitimate source. But then what you may want to do is check for other sources. So let's just let's go and do a quick search for evidence on learning styles, for example. And what we'll see is that this is an AI summary of all the research out there from the surge, and it's highlighting that learning styles are a myth. And then we've got the stubborn myth of learning styles. And we've got, here we go, a study or a document from the American Psychological Association. It does a lot of work on research on teaching and learning and so forth. And basically they provide, if you read through it, quite a bit of evidence suggesting that, well, maybe this is not very reliable. And so, you may want to, that one you can reject pretty easily, perhaps, especially if you go back to some of the original studies, and there are many of them. There are hundreds of studies, possibly thousands, that explain why, or that provide evidence that learning styles have no relationship to how people learn. And you won't really find any studies suggesting the opposite, although it may be cited as something that's really important by the companies that sell tests of learning styles. And here the next one, I'm accidentally clicking on the next one. Oh, this one. This one is kind of fun. Has anyone ever seen this before? The Pacific Northwest tree octopus is threatened with extinction. Now, the first giveaway with this is it kind of looks like a page that came out of the 1990s. And that's because it did. It was created by some professors who were teaching media literacy back in 1998, actually. And they used this as a test to see how many students believed that this was credible. And by the way, a majority of students did when they were exposed to this. Because when you look at it, there's a lot of things here that look impressive. It has the cephalopod page, which, throw in a few Latin words and that looks impressive. You've got the Octopus News Online and, and so forth. And then you've got the World Conservation Union here. You've got the Wildlife Fund and so forth. So you got a lot of legitimate sources listed here. And you got a nice fundraising thing with ribbons, which still are fairly important today. And you even got a gift shop and so forth. And here's some other things, that may make you start to question it, like the flying squid or the dwarf orca or the coconut crab, et cetera, or the Australian drop bear. So in any case, this is something that a lot of students fell for back in 1998 to 2000 when this was being used. And of course, there's the tree goats. But it's here, it has some sightings. Where there's some blurry pictures of tree octopi, and perhaps one that's not so vague, or not so blurry. But in any case, I think people can generally pick this up pretty quickly today. I think we've gotten a little bit more sophisticated. And it keeps jumping on. Here we go. And this one actually is probably worth just taking a look at. This is something that I had heard for decades from various philosophy professors and from economists about how Jeremy Bentham's body had been preserved, was stored in University College London Library, and also that as part of his will, his body was brought out in a glass display case to meetings of the board of the University College or University College Hospital. This is a slight twist on that. And the chair of the group, I had always heard it was the youngest member of the group, said that Jeremy Bentham was present but not voting since he was dead. And so if you click on this was one of the few places I found, it's probably not the best source of this, but here, it looks like a pretty detailed description of this, and it's by a First Baptist church. So it's got some religious credibility behind this, perhaps. But if you search a little bit further, and you check, because, this Baptist church may not be the best expert on utilitarian philosophers, but if you check about Jeremy Bentham, and let's throw in last will, because that's usually part of this. And there he is, there's Jeremy. And here is here's an extract from the will. And it turns out it's not actually part of his last will. His body is on display, pretty much all of his body except for his head, because preservation techniques back in the early 1800s were not quite so reliable, and his head turned all sorts of strange colors and got misshapen. It was on, for up until a couple of decades ago, it was on display at his feet. Actually, if we go to the auto icon imagery here, that's what he looks like, but the head is a wax head. The rest of him is actually real. And that was, in fact, part of his will, that his body be put on display as a condition of receiving a donation to the college. He did a lot of other interesting things, and among others, he planned the panopticon as a way of having prisons that required less supervision, because the prisoners could not tell when they were being observed because of the way it was constructed. There was a central tower where the guards were located, viewing the cells that were all around that in a circle, basically. Okay, so that one you can again find pretty easily as being a case that's not so real. Now, this is something which if you've gone to many professional development workshops, not here, but at many other institutions, you're likely to see, and it's usually done as Dale's cone of learning. And if we do a little search, we'll come back to that on Dale's cone of learning. What we'll see is a lot of imagery associated with it. And so here it is. Well, and if we look at the number of citations, by the way, it's not telling you the number of citations anymore. Huh, I'm not sure why. But in any case, cone of learning, cone of experience, this is a common sort of thing right here, where it says that people remember 10% of what they read, 20% of what audio visual materials, and 90% of what they teach to other people. And it kind of looks plausible, but and you will see in general thousands of references to this, and you'll see this in many workshops. And usually, from my own perspective, whenever I see someone saying that, it's generally someone who has never actually studied any of the research behind it, because all those numbers, it turns out, are completely made up, that there's no research suggesting any of this, and there's no real reason to believe any of this is true. Reading, you can remember much more depending on how well written something is and how engaging it is. And when people teach each other things, the amount that they remember depends a lot on how accurate their original learning was and the types of interaction and what types of things they're explaining to others. But if you do a bit of reading on this, you will find that, well, here actually, here's some researchers that cite it. Here, the interesting thing though is if you go back to the original citation, what a lot of it doesn't seem to be quite as many of these. There used to be even thousands of images out there. So I'm not sure why there's so few, because what some of the images used to do is they also contained some citations at the bottom. And it looked like they were citations, oh, well, here's a lot more. There were citations to various studies. And it turns out none of the studies existed in the actual citation as cited. One of them actually did contain some research, but it had nothing to do with, one of them was a real citation to a study, but the study had nothing to do with this cone of learning in terms of how much people remember. So, you know, if you just do a little, or let's say use cone of experience, I've often seen it as cone of learning, but let's do that. And if we look through this, we'll see, again, if you look at it a little more carefully, you'll see that, here we go. Let's look for a serious one. Here is the Brigham Young University is probably a fairly legitimate source going back to checking other sources. And here's a source of that original diagram. And if we go down, but you notice the original diagram, by the way, did not contain any of those numbers. They were added later and they were copied over and over again. So it's not really Dale's fault. It's whoever took his diagram, modified it, and then it was copied over and over again. Here we go. And here, if you read it, it talks about the bogus cone as a study back in 2003, who, you know, you'll find lots of work out there trying to debunk all of this. And let's see, I think I had one more example. No, I guess I didn't. I was sure oh yeah, I do. Here we go. This is one. Now, this is one which is kind of interesting. This came out 2 years ago, and here we go. And basically it talks about the possible invasion of the Northeast by millions of giant Zoro spiders, which are palm-sized spiders that came first to the US into Georgia, and they were predicted to spread everywhere. And here's a nice picture of it. They're pretty impressive creatures. And and it has a nice story about coming from a shipping container in 2014. And what would you guess? Would you guess that this is accurate or not? Have you seen any of these spiders out there? This is 2 years later. Well, let's go back and see if there's any other sources listed. It includes Latin names, just like the tree octopus thing did that we had up there earlier. But if we go to a new study, let's see where that new study is. It turns out to be in Scientific American, which is probably a pretty legitimate source. It has special resilience to the cold. So we haven't been seeing them. But if you read a little bit further, if you check other sources, you'll see that they actually don't, they're more afraid of people. They are venomous, but apparently they virtually never bite people. And if they do, you pretty much never really notice it because it just doesn't have much of an effect on humans unless you happen to be highly allergic to the venom, which is pretty rare. So it turns out this is actually a true thing. So this is something you could share if you want to scare your friends who may still be worrying about the murder hornets that we're still expecting any day now. So in any case, there's a lot of, the resources, this approach can be used, and it might be, if you're in a class where you're teaching students about media literacy, it's one approach and a very popular approach to having students examine materials before they share it on social media. There's a lot of good other resources here, and let me put in chat in case anyone came in later, the link so you have it. I've lost the link, but it's right here. Okay, let me put that back in there. So the link is now in the chat. Well, that's a really long link, but in any case, there's a Hapgood blog, which was created by Mike Caulfield, who's the author of the SIFT method. And it describes the SIFT method in much more detail than this. He also has a free ebook on web literacy for student fact checkers. There's also a free online mini course on using this approach. An alternative approach, which is also pretty popular, and this dates back a bit earlier than the SIFT approach, is the CRAP test, which was developed by Sarah Blakesley. And there's a link there to a description of that test. And the CRAP there stands for, at least in principle, the currency of the information, the relevance, the authority, the accuracy, and the purpose of the information, which again is basically a testing material to see whether it's likely. And there's also a little scorecard that students could use to assess that, that's linked to there. And a really good reference for this and many other things related to media literacy, including the use of fake domains, deep fakes, and many other things, is Mike Caulfield's book with Weinberg. I don't remember the other author's first name, which just came out last year, Verified: How to Think Straight, Get Duped Less, and Make Better Decisions About What to Believe Online. So if you're in an area where students might be dealing with a lot of fake information or may not be very critically analyzing it, these sources can be fairly useful. Any quick questions? I'm a bit over time. After telling everyone else to end on time.
I don't have any questions.
Okay, well, thank you. And we get ready for the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you.